그래서 이런 중요한 사건, 아니 중요한 사안에 있을 만큼은 통계학적 연구할 때 이런 엄밀한 방법을 취해야 되고, 그러기 위해서는 보통 우리가 취하는 앞에서 본 OLS 방법보다는 2SLS 방법을 취하는 것이 그것이 정확한 경향을 이끌어내는 데 도움이 된다고 하는데, 도나요 월버스 교수가 그 앞에 표에서 나온 6번의 연구 있죠? 그걸 갖다가 다 기본적으로 OLS 모델을 한 건데, 이거를 2SLS 모델로 바꿔서 봤더니 거기서 나왔던 연구 결과들이 다 유효하지 않더라 라는 결론이 나왔습니다. 즉 앞에 연구들에서는 OLS 그거를 했더니 사형이 집행되면 범죄가 줄어들더라 하는 기울기가 네거티브한 게 나오는데, 네거티브는 2SLS 모델로 정정해서 봤더니 네거티브는 네거티브만 통계적으로 유효하지 않은 결과들이 나오더라 하는 것을 밝혀냈습니다. 이러한 방법론적인 지적과 더불어서 최근에는 제5장으로 넘어가서요. 최근에는 사형제도가 범죄 억제력이 없다는 것을 뒷받치는 새로운 증거들이 나오고 있습니다. 예를 들어서 여태까지 통계학을 이 문제는 통계학 법경제학적으로 할 때는 보면 말이죠. 예를 들어서 뭐 5년, 10년이다 뭐 이런 식으로 하는데, 만약에 그냥 한 20년이다. 범위를 어떻게 설정하느냐에 따라서 다른 결론이 나올 수 있다. 그리고 그러니까는 이런 또 그 시간적인 범위뿐만 아니라 지리적인 범위. 예를 들어서 미국은 커다란 나라죠. 근데 만약에 뉴욕에서 사형 집행이 된 경우가 LA에서 어떤 범죄 억지력을 행사할 수 있을까요? 이런 거는 별 생각 안 해왔다는 거죠. 그러니까는 이 데이터를 사용할 때 이런 것들이 엄밀하지 못하게 사용되었다는 것을 얘기하면서 12페이지에 넘어가서 중간쯤에요. 그래서 이런 것들이 결국 그런 식으로 막 뉴욕에서 사형 집행된 게 LA에 무슨 효과가 있느냐 없느냐 따지면 먼저 국지적으로 단기적으로 보면은 그래서 이제 신문이나 텔레비전 뉴스 이런 거 하고 이렇게 하는데, 결국은 단기적 관점에서 본다면 그 도시에서 범죄 발생을 억제하는 효과를 보여주는 증거는 얻을 수 없다라고 하는 결론을 내고 있습니다. 사형제도와 범죄 억제 효과가 하는 상관을 밝힌 것은 다양한 변수를 종합적으로 고려하는 방법으로 매우 어려운 작업인데, 억제서를 지지하는 연구들은 단순 교차 분석을 통해 변수 간의 상관관계를 너무나 이렇게 쉽게 맺어주는 경향을 보여주고 있는 반면에, 도나요 월버스 같은 사람들은 이런 연구들이 결국은 방법처럼 오류가 있다는 걸 보이고 있다는 것을 우리가 알 수 있었고요. 사형제도라고 하는 것은 정부와 시민으로 하여금 고비용을 부담케 하는 비효율적인 형사제재 수단뿐만 아니라 범죄를 억제해주는 효과가 확실한 수단이 아니죠. 우리가 거기에 대해서 법경제학적 중에 어느 누구도 만장일치 결론을 못 냈다면 우리가 사실 어떤 결론도 갖지 못한 현재 확신을 갖고 결론을 낼 수 없는 상태라고 말할 수 있겠습니다. 이런 상태에 또 형벌의 목적이 있는 것이다. 아까 제가 처음에 시작할 뻔했습니다. 형벌의 목적이 무엇이냐를 생각해 볼 때 형벌의 목적이 단순히 일반 예방이 아닐지인데, 사형제도의 종파를 도모하면서 먼저 현대적인 형벌의 목적이 무엇인가 다시 한번 상기하고 형벌의 제도의 본질에 대해서 숙고해야 되지 않겠는가, 이렇게 생각해서 끝맺은 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
And as Professor Holm also mentioned in his comments, this is a discussion that, as he described from before the incidents in Korea, shouldn't be legally emotional in some sense. It should be a very thoughtful, sort of careful, calm discussion about what does the death penalty mean, and whether it should be something which in this society, in Korea or in the United States or anywhere else, should be a penalty given for the crime of murder. Now, as Professor Hong described in his work, in his paper, there is, as you can see, a very big debate in the United States about whether or not the death penalty actually has some effect on murder in the United States. And he introduced to you primarily the research of John Donahue and Justin Wolfers in his paper. And just to give you who they are, John Donahue is a professor at Yale Law School, and Justin Wolfers is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. And they take a law and economics approach in thinking about the question of whether the death penalty has any effect. And they were responding, their research is a response to an earlier work done by Ulrich, as he mentioned, University of Chicago professor, who did a study about the effect of the death penalty on murder in the United States. And Professor Ulrich's work was very instrumental, as Professor Hong mentioned. It was cited from various academic papers, as well as in the United States. The Solicitor General is the lawyer for the United States government who argues Supreme Court cases. The Solicitor General also used Professor Ulrich's work in defending the government's use of the death penalty in the United States in favor of the death penalty. And so Donahue and Wolfers argue with their analysis, saying that the death penalty has no effect, or little or no effect, on murder in the United States. And so they wrote a very big paper which was discussed much in the United States. And so I cannot comment on their studies because if you look at the economic analysis, and I noticed that Professor Hong has a book here, Basic Econometrics. It's a very difficult subject, and I can't even begin to try to explain to you the different graphs or the different statistics or the different factors they use to calculate all the different variables and the XY axis and whether there's some relationship between the death penalty and murder. I think it's a very difficult task. But they tried to do it, and they found evidence that there's no relationship between the two. But I'd like to actually present to you at least a counter perspective. And if you look on page, in here on page 9 in the graph, you see a reference to Desbach. On the first line, Desbach is a professor at Emory University. And he and another professor at Emory, Paul Rubin, they wrote a series of papers arguing against Donahue and Wolfers. There's a very active, if you read the literature, very active debate between these two sides. And they criticized Donahue and Wolfers, saying that they're wrong. That in fact, the evidence does support that there is a connection between the death penalty and decline of murder rates in the United States. And so they accused Donahue and Wolfers, they accused them of basically having a bias, saying that Donahue and Wolfers are against the death penalty. So they have a bias in their research, and they have an agenda. And so when they do their research, they're not very objective. What they do is that they take certain data, and they fit the data for their result. And so the data that they show and the statistics, the models that they come up with show that there is no effect between the death penalty and murder rates. But they say that our perspective is correct because if you look at our analysis, it shows that the death penalty does have an effect on murder rates. And so it's a very interesting debate. Again, I don't think Professor Hong or I can comment on the nature of the statistics in these reports, but I think it's a very interesting issue. And so my own questions that I have, just not for necessarily Professor Hong specifically, but for maybe us to consider as a whole in looking at this research, there are basically two questions. Because law and economics is a very powerful argument, a very powerful rhetorical tool in the United States to argue about law. I mean, if you argue with Richard Posner, who's one of the greatest judges in the United States today, who is a very strong proponent of law and economics, it's very difficult to argue with people who have law and economics on their side. Because they have statistics, they seem to have hard evidence to choose between what law should be in place or not. So, I have a particular question about this because I think it's difficult to quantify how many lives are lost or saved because of the death penalty. To me, just as an average person, as a lay person, it seems very difficult to statistically quantify how to measure the effect of the death penalty on someone's decision to commit murder or not to commit murder. Because I think, just from my personal perspective, I may be wrong, the biggest question for you to think about is, do people use rational choice theory before they decide to act in certain ways? So, if a murderer is thinking about committing a murder, or someone's thinking about murdering somebody, do they think about, okay, this state has the death penalty, so maybe I shouldn't commit murder? I mean, does that factor into the calculation for someone to think about whether they commit murder or not? I know that these are big statistics, but at a very individual level, whether or not rational choice theory is something which really affects the behavior of people. I think most people think, yes, rational choice theory has a really big impact on the way we think about how people make decisions. But I have a question. I'm not sure if it's true to say that just because people make economic decisions, that factors in quite prominently in thinking about whether someone commits a murder or doesn't commit murder. So that's my first question. Whether rational choice theory is an effective tool to think about human behavior so that we can think about law and policy. That's my first question. And the second question is, the rhetoric of law and economics, because they use econometrics as a tool, seems to be very persuasive. Okay? However, is it something that we should consider very deeply when we think about policy? Is law and economics and econometrics something which is relevant for discussing policy? So even whether or not the question of whether or not the death penalty deters or not deters, is that a relevant question anyway to think about whether or not the death penalty should be an appropriate punishment for people in society? So don't care about the utility of death penalty. Maybe that question is irrelevant. I'm going to propose that question to you. Whether it is appropriate form of thinking for us in thinking about law and policy. And so furthermore, the broader question is, what is the ultimate utility of law and economics in terms of formulating legal rules? Is it desirable to construct rules and penalties in such a way in order to maximize some aspect of efficiency? Now, my understanding of law and economics is that law and economics purports to be a perspective that allows society to maximize some efficiency, maximize some sort of value. The question is that a relevant basis for which we should consider thinking about rules? Now, I teach at a Christian law school, and so I think that I've heard different perspectives about, even despite utility, there may be morally justifiable grounds to employ the death penalty, despite the fact it has useful value in terms of deterring crime or not. Punishment is no relationship to some broader social utility. I know it's a perspective that people have discussed before, but that's a question which I'd like to raise from this very good sort of description of the current debate between these kinds of issues involving death penalty.